If your company imports steel, cement, or aluminium into the European Union, a new rule is quietly reshaping what those goods cost at the border. It's called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and it's the EU's way of putting a carbon price on imports. In the next few minutes, we'll break down exactly how it works, in plain English. Let's start with the basics. CBAM stands for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It was established by Regulation, EU, 2023/956, and it's one of the more ambitious pieces of climate policy the European Union has introduced in recent years. To understand why it exists, you need to understand a problem called carbon leakage. Inside the EU, many industries pay a price for the greenhouse gases they emit. That cost is real, and it's built into the price of things like steel and cement produced in Europe. Now imagine a manufacturer outside the EU that doesn't face an equivalent carbon cost. Their goods can be cheaper simply because they aren't paying for their emissions. Two things can happen as a result. European companies might move carbon-intensive production abroad to escape the cost, or cheaper, higher carbon imports might undercut goods made inside the EU. Either way, emissions don't fall, they just shift somewhere else. That shifting is what carbon leakage means. CBAM is designed to close that gap. The idea is to put a carbon price on imports that's equivalent to what EU producers already pay for their own emissions. So a ton of imported steel carries a comparable carbon cost to a ton made in Europe. In other words, the goal isn't to punish trade or block imports. It's to make sure that climate policy inside Europe doesn't simply push emissions, and the production that goes with them, over the border to somewhere with weaker rules. One quick clarification, because the language matters. You'll very often hear CBAM described as a carbon border tax. It's an easy shorthand, and it captures the spirit of it. But technically, it isn't a traditional tax. Instead of levying a duty, the mechanism requires importers to buy and surrender certificates that represent the emissions embedded in their goods. The distinction sounds academic, but it shapes everything about how the system actually operates, as you'll see in a moment. So what does CBAM actually apply to? It doesn't cover everything crossing the EU border. It targets specific sectors that are both carbon-intensive and exposed to international trade. At launch, CBAM covers 6 categories of goods: cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. These are the heavy hitters of industrial emissions, the materials where production tends to release large amounts of carbon, and where the risk of leakage is highest. If you're importing any of these into the EU, CBAM is relevant to your operations. That focus on 6 sectors is deliberate. Rather than trying to cover every product at once, the EU concentrated on the industries where carbon pricing and leakage risk matter most. Now, here's the piece that ties everything together: the EU Emissions Trading System, usually shortened to the EU ETS. The ETS is Europe's existing carbon market. Under it, industrial installations inside the EU have to hold allowances for the emissions they produce, and those allowances carry a market price. CBAM is deliberately built to mirror that price. The cost of a CBAM certificate is tied to what EU producers are paying under the ETS. That's the whole mechanism for keeping imported and domestic goods on a level footing. There's an important transition happening in parallel. For years, certain EU industries have received free emission allowances, essentially a cushion to protect them from carbon leakage while the rest of the world caught up. As CBAM phases in, those free allowances are being phased out. The two moves are linked. As domestic producers lose their free allowances and start paying more of the full carbon price, CBAM ramps up on imports to match. This phase-out is scheduled to happen gradually between 2026 and 2034. Think of it as 2 dials moving in opposite directions. As the free allowance dial turns down for European industry, the CBAM dial turns up for imports, so that over time, both are exposed to broadly the same carbon price. CBAM rolls out in 2 distinct phases, and knowing which phase you're in changes what's expected. The design is intentionally gradual, a slow ramp rather than a sudden switch, giving everyone in the chain time to adjust. The first is the transitional period. It runs from the 1st of October, 2023 to the end of 2025. During this window, importers of covered goods have one main obligation: reporting. Every quarter, they report the emissions embedded in the goods they've imported. Crucially, there are no payments during this phase. No certificates change hands yet. The transitional period is essentially a learning phase, a chance for importers, manufacturers, and regulators to build the data systems and get comfortable with the reporting before real money is involved. The second phase is the definitive regime. It begins on the 1st of January, 2026, and this is when CBAM gains real force. From that point, importers can't just report, they need to be authorized CBAM declarants. They have to buy CBAM certificates, priced on the EU ETS carbon price, and surrender those certificates to cover the emissions embedded in their imports. The reporting also becomes a formal annual process. The first annual CBAM declaration, covering goods imported during 2026, is due by the 31st of May, 2027. Let's make this concrete. In practice, what does an importer under the definitive regime actually handle? Broadly, there are a few core steps. First, become an authorized CBAM declarant. That's the status needed to import covered goods once the definitive regime is running. Second, gather accurate data on the embedded emissions of those goods. Third, buy CBAM certificates that reflect the EU ETS price. And fourth, surrender enough certificates each year to match the emissions in what was imported, and file the annual declaration. One nuance worth understanding is what embedded emissions actually captures. The reporting covers direct emissions, the carbon released in producing the goods themselves. And for some goods, it also covers certain indirect emissions, such as those from the electricity used in production. That's why the data behind CBAM has to be fairly detailed. A rough estimate isn't the intent of the system, the mechanism is only as fair as the numbers feeding into it. Finally, who does this actually touch? The obvious answer is EU importers of the covered goods. They hold the legal obligations, and they're the ones interacting with the CBAM system directly. But the reach goes further, and this is the part that's easy to miss. Because the mechanism is built on the emissions embedded in production, the accurate data has to come from the production site itself. That means non-EU manufacturers and exporters who supply into the EU are drawn in too. An EU importer can only report and surrender certificates properly if the factory abroad can tell them how carbon-intensive the goods really are. So even a producer with no legal obligation under EU law has a strong commercial reason to measure and share their emissions data, because their EU customers now need it. That's the quiet significance of CBAM. It's an EU regulation, but its gravity extends across global supply chains, anywhere carbon-intensive goods are made and then sold into Europe. Understood plainly, it isn't a wall around the market, it's an attempt to make the carbon price follow the product, wherever that product was made. If this breakdown helps CBAM make sense, consider subscribing to Compliance Decoded. We turn dense regulation into plain language explainers you can actually use. And we'd genuinely like to hear from you. Are you on the importing side, the manufacturing side, or just trying to stay ahead of what's coming? Drop a comment and tell us which rule you'd like decoded next. Educational overview only, not legal or compliance advice. Consult a qualified professional for your situation.